So all of our speakers today are doing cutting edge work to better identify, understand, and combat human trafficking. And I hope this session today will bring attention to and catalyze new kinds of discussions on this issue and problem of human trafficking.
As Kathleen said, I will be talking about COVID-19 and emergencies as determinants of anti-trafficking efforts. And I kind of planned the presentation around kind of the first half focusing on determinants and the second half focusing on emergencies and COVID-19 as an example of an emergency. And part of that is because of some of the collaboration, some of the discussions that we've had with Kathleen over the past few years around kind of different types of emergencies and their impacts on anti-trafficking efforts. But I want to start with a bit of context for the project and the research more broadly. So working in anti-trafficking for a number of years, about 15 years in total, both in the kind of NGO sector, but then also in the research sector, we kind of started noticing a number of categories of research. So we have research about kind of the experiences of trafficking, data around trafficking itself, etc. We then also have quite a lot of literature, which is the ones that I'm particularly familiar with, which is on the responses to trafficking, so anti-trafficking efforts, what measures are out there and what is working and what isn't working. I will say the what is working, what isn't working, that sort of monitoring and evaluation side of that analysis is there, but a bit missing, but that's kind of besides the point of what I'm talking about today. But what we saw as missing was the kind of the link in between, which is we know that there are these efforts out there. We know that governments are implementing some anti-trafficking efforts, but we wanted to understand why. So we wanted to ask the question of why do governments implement anti-trafficking efforts? And that is the project that we've been working on. We worked on this for about just under 3 years, so just over 2.5, I should say, 2.5 years. It was a project funded by the US State Department, the Trafficking in Persons Office, which Kathleen spoke about before. And the project has allowed us to really kind of reach out to as many stakeholders as we could think of in various ways, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, to really capture their impressions of why states implement anti-trafficking efforts and why they implement the anti-trafficking efforts that they are actually implementing. I think one of the things that comes out very clearly is that it's not about a yes or no on anti-trafficking measures. A lot of these determinants are focused and are influencing the type of response that is put in place, the type of the target of that response, as well as the kind of operationalization of that response. So let me just very quickly outline the methods that we used. So the project, as I said, lasted over 2.5 years. It started just before COVID struck. So this was kind of, COVID was one of those challenges / opportunities that came up with this project. And I can explain a bit more on the opportunities side. But the methods that we had for this project included a literature review, trying to be as systematic as possible with that literature review. I will say that almost all the key part of the literature review was qualitative research. We then also did a significant piece of quantitative research, primarily trying to identify correlations between existing data sets, looking at the Trafficking in Persons report ranking of countries against the ranking or the score received for other indices, such as things like GDP, etc., but also things like the Rule of Law Index, and similar, the Fragile State Index, etc., and similar indices that are out there. The third thing that we did was a series of stakeholder interviews. Now, this is, again, one of the opportunities of COVID. We were supposed to do 25, split across 4 locations, basically New York / DC, Vienna / Geneva, London, and Bangkok. Because of COVID, we only managed to do in-person interviews in New York and DC. And then we had to switch to everything being online, but that allowed us to actually reach a much wider audience of stakeholders. So actually, instead of 25, we ended up doing 54 interviews and one focus group discussion. The next thing we did was a global survey. We sent out a survey to our kind of network of organizations and stakeholders involved in various countries. We had around 200 or so responses to our survey, and those were analyzed as part of the kind of broader analysis that we undertook. The next thing we did was a series of case studies. Again, we were supposed to have 10 case studies, which got expanded to 14 in the course of the project, partly because we had an underspend on the project because of not being able to travel, etc. So we were able to extend the number of countries that we were particularly looking at. Those 14 case studies, I won't try to name them all, but they included countries across various regions. They were primarily countries that over time saw an improvement in their anti-trafficking efforts, with a couple of exceptions where we try to also look at countries that were either consistently in tier 3 or consistently in tier 1, but where we knew there were changes happening that may or may not have affected the score, either because the score was already good or because or for other reasons.
Jean-Pierre, could I just interrupt? So we weren't sure if your slides should be transitioning because we're still just seeing the title slide.
No, it should be the title slide for now.
Okay, just want to double check. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. What was I saying? Yeah, so, and then obviously the last bit was trying to bring everything together. Speaking, and I think Dominique mentioned before, the need to make sure that we're talking a common language. That was one of the challenges for this project, because obviously if you speak to different stakeholders, especially different stakeholders that come to trafficking from different areas, they do tend to have slightly different understandings. Obviously, terminology around determinants itself was also kind of not necessarily always understood, etc. So there were kind of some of these terminological issues that we had to deal with. Because of COVID, we also then kind of developed a stream of work within the project that was focusing specifically on COVID-19 as a determinant of anti-trafficking efforts. Again, we weren't necessarily thinking about COVID-19 as a factor influencing trafficking itself. There's a lot of other work which has been done on that, but we're trying to focus on COVID-19 as a determinant of anti-trafficking efforts specifically. So when we talk about determinants, we have a number of kind of general observations on determinants, and then I'll focus a bit more on the on emergencies. Sorry, there's an ambulance going by the office. So one of the key findings was of how interconnected all of these determinants are, and the image on the right of the slide, that was intended to be a neat diagram that showed some of these interconnections, and then it became that, so we couldn't really use it. So we just kind of use it to make the point of just how convoluted some of those connections are. But I think the point is that each one of these determinants is related to all of the others of these determinants, essentially. The second thing is that determinants are non-linear. Originally, we were kind of thinking naively of determinants as, oh, this thing influences something, which then results in an outcome. But actually, one of the things that comes out very clearly from the research is that very often determinants will lead to outcomes, and those outcomes will themselves become determinants. And I think political will is, for example, a very clear example of that, where political will is itself the outcome of many other determinants, but it also becomes a determinant of anti-trafficking efforts in its own right. We also have determinants that are positive, some that are neutral, and some that are negative. So again, one of the things that kind of became much clearer as we went kind of through the project was that not all determinants are positive. right? So some are neutral in the sense that they provide a context, but they don't really go in one direction or the other. So if we think about COVID, for example, it is the influence of other determinants that will determine whether the response is a positive one or a negative one in terms of anti-trafficking, right? In some ways, the same determinant can be both positive and negative, as well as being neutral. When we talk about positive, we mean pushing anti-trafficking in the direction that we would like it to move, which is largely informed by adherence to the standards of the Palermo Protocol. And when we talk about negative, we're moving further away from that. However, that is, again, it's not a yes or no whether a determinant is positive, right? So you can have a determinant which is positive for certain types of trafficking. So you can have determinants which are positive determinants for anti-trafficking efforts related to sex trafficking, but that don't really work for labor trafficking. Or you have determinants that are positive or negative with regards to the type of response. So you have determinants that are very positive in terms of a kind of law enforcement response to trafficking, but negative when it comes to a victim protection informed anti-trafficking effort. Determinants can be active or passive. A key example of this, an active determinant is NGO activism, right? So NGOs taking cases to court, so strategic litigation, but also kind of advocacy with stakeholders, with voters, et cetera, or passive is things that kind of happen in the background that kind of support or negate some of the other determinants, but are themselves passive. So things like the country's economic situation, right? It's not active in the same way that a piece of litigation or a activism by NGOs would be. Some determinants are specific to anti-trafficking. So there are anti-trafficking specific work. So an NGO that focuses specifically on anti-trafficking. Some are contextual. So they influence things that are kind of broader than trafficking, but by influencing or by hopefully positively influencing those developments, you're also positively influencing an anti-trafficking response. Key example on that is housing, for example. So things that will influence or will improve the housing situation in a particular country or the way a country deals with homelessness will also have a positive impact on anti-trafficking, or is a positive development for anti-trafficking as well. But it is contextual because the people doing that advocacy, for example, are not necessarily doing it for trafficking, they're doing it for a different issue. And in some cases, it's tangential. It's something that is kind of, twice removed from trafficking, but might also have an impact on trafficking. One example of that is, for example, for example, a state that wants to be seen as being a positive player on the international scene, right? So generally speaking, there's a push for a state to abide by its international obligations, and suddenly that starts to influence anti-trafficking as part of the obligations that state has in international law. Similarly, determinants can be direct or indirect, and they are all context specific. So I keep mentioning NGO activism. NGO activism in a country where you have a lot of NGO freedom, where you have freedom of expression, where you have freedom of the press, where you have freedom of assembly is one thing, whilst obviously NGO activism in a country which is much more restrictive, where it is much more dangerous to be an activist in this space, etc., is all of that is context specific. In some cases, the same determinant can be positive or negative, depending also on that particular context. Determinants can be personal, institutional, or cultural or social, I should say. Personal determinants are determinants influencing particular individuals to act in a certain way. We had the examples in the UK, in Bahrain, and in Chile of particular individuals who were really kind of prominent activists or pushing for a particular anti-trafficking agenda, whether that was the Home Secretary and then Prime Minister Theresa May in the UK, or a Congresswoman in Chile, or a acting Prime Minister in Bahrain. Institutional is determinants that influence institutions and how those institutions act. That is whether it's advocacy, whether it's, for example, a decision by a regional human rights court that says that particular institutions, whether it's the police, whether it's the victim protection services, etc., need to act in a certain way, and that influences that institution to start doing more in the context of trafficking. Or it can also be cultural or social, kind of, so broader, kind of in the broader societal context, right? So that includes things like how the media reports on trafficking, for example. Now, these determinants will affect every stage of the anti-trafficking response, and our kind of framing of the anti-trafficking response in terms of timeline, for lack of a better way of putting it, goes from kind of acknowledgement of trafficking as an issue that deserves policy attention, to the framing of trafficking, to prioritization of anti-trafficking as a policy issue, to the development of new policy, the resourcing of those initiatives, the implementation of those initiatives, and then monitoring and evaluation. Each one of these is obviously particularly can be kind of broken down even further. Obviously, with acknowledgement and framing, we really spent quite a bit of time talking about framing when we spoke to stakeholders and when we engaged with the survey responses, etc. Because the way anti-trafficking is framed will make a difference with how all the other determinants engage with the response to trafficking, right? So if we frame trafficking as only being an issue that affects foreigners, which many countries did, right? Then suddenly the anti-trafficking responses that will come from that understanding of trafficking will be very specific. It might focus on things like border control. It might focus on certain types of trafficking that we know affect migrant workers or migrants more than domestic victims. But then domestic victims are suddenly going to be kind of framed out of that anti-trafficking response. Similarly, if we focus only on sex trafficking, then anything to do with labor trafficking gets exploited. And I will say that one of the things that we're exploring now as kind of part of the follow-up thinking from this project is how these different frames in themselves become part of the problem as well as the solution, but most importantly, how each of these different frames are not necessarily as different as we might in practice as we might think that they are. So we're very interested in things like issues around sexual abuse in the context of labor trafficking, for example. The question of prioritization comes up a lot in the context of emergencies and in the context of COVID, because it's all well and good to have the kind of very vocal response to trafficking in saying, yes, trafficking is bad, we need to deal with it, etc. But then prioritizing it and resourcing it specifically are kind of a next step, and not necessarily one that always immediately follows in the way it probably should. Sorry, I'm conscious of time. The other thing that it affects is the type and that determinants affect are the type and stage of response. So by type of response, we obviously kind of separate out the more law enforcement, more security or traditional security focused responses to trafficking, things like border control, things like policing, things like setting up specialized police units, etc., or kind of more victim protection kind of focused responses to trafficking. And the other part is also the stage of response, right? So depending on how you frame trafficking, how you prioritize anti-trafficking efforts, different responses will come in at different stages of trafficking and of responding to trafficking. We also see different determinants resulting in different modes of responses, primarily kind of the more formalistic responses versus the more substantive responses. Things like the kind of naming and shaming by the international community, whether that's the TIP report, the Greta reports, etc. They're like in some contexts are likely to result in more kind of formalistic responses where we have the adoption of law and policy, for example, whilst things like litigation, things like advocacy by NGOs, involvement of trade unions and survivor-led organizations are a bit more likely, again, and this is very context dependent, to result in substantive changes. And obviously, it's not one or the other, right? Every response that is given will include more or less of both of these. So even a very substantive, very practice-focused response will invariably include some of that formalistic response. Because at the end of the day, states don't only want to counter trafficking, they also want to be seen as countering trafficking, because that is part of being seen as being a good player on the international community in the context of the Palermo Protocol. It's seen as a good way of raising donor funds and etc., and getting a better ranking in the TIP report, etc., etc. And then we have some of these determinants which are structural and some which are pressure points. So structural are kind of the frameworks in the country within which all of these determinants interact, and others are specific kind of pressure points that can be used in order to, or points of pressure, I should say, that can be used to push a particular agenda. So a structural factor is something like the way the state is organized. Pressure point is something like litigation, for example. I don't know how much more time there is, so I'll focus on this, and I'll combine what I was going to say about COVID into what I'll be saying about emergencies as well. So we did look specifically at emergencies and anti-trafficking. We see in some way similar trends in natural disasters and other emergencies, whether that's conflict, whether that's COVID, or health emergencies, I should say more broadly, but COVID in particular, etc. The key trend is that we see an increased need for anti-trafficking efforts, but a reduced effort to counter trafficking. The increased level, we see an increased level of trafficking, and we see a heightened vulnerability to trafficking, both in terms of communities that are already vulnerable to trafficking being more vulnerable to trafficking in the context of emergencies, but also the circle of people that are vulnerable to trafficking getting wider and wider in the context of emergencies. So we have vulnerability becoming worse and more people becoming vulnerable, I guess, is another way of putting that. On the other hand, we do have a recognition of vulnerability. So if you look at what's going on in Ukraine, for example, we've seen quite a strong emphasis on issues around trafficking, right? Around the risk of trafficking. Admittedly, usually focused on women and children, admittedly focused primarily on specific types of exploitation, specific types of trafficking, but we do see some more recognition. And I think that is something that we're seeing more and more now. Again, reasons for that are slightly besides the point here. We have seen that a lot more in the European context, at least. And I don't know whether this carries to the US or elsewhere, but we have seen much more recognition of that vulnerability when it comes to Ukrainian people displaced from the conflict in Ukraine, as opposed, for example, to people displaced from the conflict in Syria in 2015. The other kind of overarching determinant in all of this is the breakdown of the rule of law. Now, part of this is obviously we do come to this issue as lawyers, both Noemi and myself are legally trained, and we do kind of take our initial premise from international law. But obviously, the more the rule of law breaks down, the less likely you are to identify people as having been trafficked, to hold traffickers to account, and then obviously to protect trafficked people, but also to hold the state to account for failures to protect people who have been trafficked, or for failures of the state to prevent trafficking from taking place. The other thing that we see is the deprioritization of trafficking, because very often anti-trafficking is not seen as a life-saving effort. We see kind of, obviously in the context of conflict, in the context of natural disasters, as well as of health crises, we see kind of the prioritization of what are immediately seen as life-saving efforts, whether that's, healthcare, etc., whilst kind of broader societal concerns like anti-trafficking are deprioritized. Part of that is because donor attention gets diverted elsewhere. And we saw in the context of COVID, for example, that many of the kind of big development and humanitarian donors have kind of shifted their attention to deal with COVID. In some cases, dealing with COVID as it relates to other areas, including anti-trafficking, but unfortunately, in the most part, shifting attention to kind of completely to responding to COVID or to the health emergency, and leaving other kind of types of other issues behind, essentially. Besides donor attention, the other thing that we see is legislative and policy attention being diverted. So in Chile and Armenia, when there were conflicts, when there were crises, we saw policy initiatives, we saw legislative drafts being dropped because the focus became on whatever is happening right now, and therefore we don't have time to deal with the adoption of legislation on trafficking. And again, this is partly because it's not seen, anti-trafficking is not seen as life-saving. And part of this is because we don't have a mainstreaming of anti-trafficking considerations in emergency responses. So one of the things that we are interested in looking at in more detail, together with Kathleen actually, is how do we mainstream anti-trafficking in emergency responses, and how do we mainstream emergency considerations into anti-trafficking responses. So that's broadly speaking on emergencies. Kathleen, I don't know whether I have time to go into the COVID stuff or whether I should stop there.
Maybe just if you can briefly kind of summarize, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. So with COVID, I think there were a few different things that came across. So one was issues around kind of the same determinants trying to deal with very new vulnerabilities. Those new vulnerabilities were things like the shifting of, or rather the significant increase of online sexual exploitation, for example, or online exploitation more generally, was some of those kind of older determinants or determinants that stood there before were trying to deal with this particular kind of new reality. There were very practical challenges in anti-trafficking efforts, things like, do kind of the relevant departments, the relevant institutions, etc., have stable internet connections? How can you investigate if you cannot actually visit places, etc.? And this move towards remote courts and tribunals. What we see there is also, in some ways, an opportunity to learn for some other types of responses, right? So if we could have remote participation in trials in the context of COVID when courts were closed, is there a reason that we cannot use similar mechanisms for people who may have been deported or who may have gone back to their countries of origin to participate in trials against their perpetrators, or in trials where they're seeking compensation either from the trafficker or from the state? Obviously, in the context of COVID-19, securitization became one of the key determinants, whether that was the closure of borders, which again increased the vulnerability of many people to trafficking because the cost of smuggling became more expensive, which meant that more people were pushed into the hands of into exploitative situations and situations of vulnerability, which in some cases translated into trafficking. What we also saw is health emergencies like COVID being used as a pretext for states to do or not do things that they wanted to do or didn't want to do in the first place, and where COVID became kind of the overarching excuse that we can use for everything else. And I think we've seen that across many areas, but we also see that in the context of COVID. And I think the question, and I guess this is open for conversation, is what comes next and what lessons have we learned? If there had to be another health emergency in, I don't know, 24 months' time, will we have learned anything from COVID to make sure that anti-trafficking responses in the time of that new emergency are not jeopardized? I think, unfortunately, the answer to that is subject to some cynicism. Let's put it diplomatically. But because I think, unfortunately, just like we didn't learn from natural disasters, just like we didn't learn from conflict, and we kind of had all of these effects in the context of COVID, I suspect that will happen moving forward as well. That being said, I'll stop there, but very happy to answer any questions or comments that people might have.
Thank you so much, Jean-Pierre, for a great